We're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. This webinar is offered through IRC's Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Assistance, or META project. META is focused on building the capacity of refugee service providers in the U.S. to collect, manage, analyze, and use quality data to improve services and outcomes for our clients. Funding for META comes from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement. The materials presented during this webinar today are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not represent the official views of ACF. My name is Jamie Costigan, and I am the Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Advisor for the META project and IRC's U.S. programs. I also want to introduce Meg Gibbon. She is META's Program Manager, and in a moment she'll walk through some WebEx logistics. If you have any technological issues at any time, you can message her directly in the chat, or you can email meta@rescue.org. And then finally, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Bill Evans. Professor Evans is the Keogh Hesburgh Professor of Economics and Department Chair at the University of Notre Dame. He has a PhD in economics from Duke University and is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is also the founder of the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, a research center that partners with local service providers to find evidence-based solutions to poverty. In today's webinar, we're going to learn about the recent working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research titled The Economic and Social Outcomes of Refugees in the U.S., Evidence from the ACS. This study was conducted by Professor Evans with the graduate student Daniel Fitzerald from the University of Notre Dame. The study uses the data from the American Community Survey to understand how refugee outcomes change as they age in place. In this webinar, we're going to learn about the methodology of this study, the findings, its implications, and we're also going to gain some insight into the potential for and some of the limitations to researchers and refugee service providers at the national, state, and local level using the ACS to understand refugee resettlement outcomes. But before we do that, I'm going to hand over quickly to Meg to go over the logistics.
Thanks, Jamie. So everyone is currently muted just because we do have a large group on the line today, but we would love your participation throughout the webinar. So if you have questions at any time, don't hesitate to use the chat box to type those in. You can also use the Q&A field. In that option, your questions won't become public to all the attendees until we type out an answer to them. So we can either do that during the training or at the end, depending on what your question is. You can also click the hand icon to raise your hand if you have a question towards the end of the presentation, and we can open up your line. If you have any trouble with the audio, I know you're hearing me now, but you can click on event info for the dial-in number and code, or like Jimmy mentioned, feel free to send a message to me in the chat at any time, and we can try to get you connected. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Evans to kick off our presentation.
Thank you very much. I want to thank IRC for setting this up, Jamie and Meg for sort of walking me through the technology for this, and all of you for attending. The timing of this couldn't be better. We won't talk about that too much. This is work that I've done with Danny Fitzgerald, who's a former undergraduate here from Notre Dame, who's in a graduate program on data science right now. We started this work actually in the summer of 2016, and the timing of its release was at a period where heightened interest in this topic. We did this work as part of research here at the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities. As Jamie said, we're a research center that's interested in evidence-based solutions to poverty. Our anchor partner so far has been local Catholic charities, which are instrumental in the refugee resettlement process. We have an interest in the refugee issue given our ties, and we also have a project on refugee resettlement right now with Lutheran Services of America down in Texas, and so we have some experience in this issue. The motivation for this is obviously the current refugee crisis. The UN estimates there's 21 million refugees, about 41 million people displaced from their homes. The U.S. has been active in the refugee resettlement business with about 3.5 million people resettled since '75. The sad fact is that less than 1% of refugees are actively resettled by another country, but half of that has come in the United States, which has been a big player in this area. There's a large literature across the social sciences that examines the assimilation of immigrants, but there's less of a literature on refugees. That's because refugees typically are not identified in most large federal surveys from other immigrants, and therefore it's hard to sort of extract them from the data. There is some literature on this topic, but it's for very specific groups, refugees from Vietnam or Soviet Jews, or particular groups that have a high fraction of refugees. What we do in this paper is use a procedure to identify refugees in the ACS that we'll talk about in just a moment, and then we generate what we call synthetic cohorts of children, refugees that arrived as children under 20 years of age and refugees that arrive as adults, and we kind of follow them over a 20-year period. Not literally each person, but someone that came 20 years ago, someone that came 19, someone that came 18, and we just take a look at the time path of their social and economic outcomes as they age in place. The results that we're going to see on children are fairly encouraging in that those that arrive roughly 14 and under tend to graduate high school and college at rates that are very comparable to natives. In some respects, those at a younger age are graduating at higher rates. And we see that their labor market outcomes are similar to natives, conditional on education. So refugees that arrive as children are doing actually reasonably well. We're going to see this, those that are arriving a little bit later in their teen years aren't doing as well, but there's some reasonable explanations for that. On the adult side, what we're going to see is adults are arriving at this country with conditions that are going to predict poor economic success. They have lower levels of education, obviously fewer years of experience and worse language skills, but their outcomes tend to improve rapidly over time. Then what we're going to do is take a look at some calculations we've made about the fiscal costs associated with refugees. We're going to take into consideration not only the direct cost of resettling the refugees, but also the indirect costs of them participating in social insurance programs. What we're going to add to the equation is we're going to try to calculate how much they're paying in taxes. And what we're going to find is that after 9 years in the U.S., refugees among adults tend to be net contributors to the fiscal side, and if you add them up over a 20-year period, the net taxes tend to be greater than the benefits that are received. So just a little background on the American Community Survey. This is a 1% sample of the U.S. population every year. It is an address-based sample, so they're getting people in houses, in dorms, in nursing homes, in jails. The survey is designed to be pulled over multiple years to provide aggregate data for small geographic areas, and it really replaced the census long-form data. The data that we're going to use is the ACS that's pulled from 2010 and 2015, which gives us roughly 5% of the U.S. population. What makes this work is that in the ACS they ask when did immigrants come to the country and where they came from, and so as a result we can sort of get an indication of when people are coming from particular regions. The way in which we identify refugees in the ACS has been used by a couple other groups in similar ways. In the ACS there's a sample weight attached to every person that's supposed to represent how many people are you counting. So if we take a bunch of immigrants who came from country C in a particular year, we can use that sample weight and get a rough count of how many immigrants are coming in. We know from Department of Homeland Security exactly how many refugees are admitted to this country from a particular country in a given year. And what we can do is calculate what we call the refugee concentration ratio. Let's count the number of refugees we know came from country C in year T, divided by the number of people we see in the ACS from that same country year pair. And when that ratio is greater than a particular value as it approaches 1, it's a high likelihood that the immigrant is coming as a refugee. In what we do, we take this relative concentration ratio of greater than 0.7 as refugees, and that's kind of the basis for our work. Graphically, this is on the vertical axis the number of refugees that are identified from a country year pair from the Department of Homeland Security, and then on the horizontal axis, it's the immigrants that we're counting using the sample weights from the ACS in those same country and year pairs. And that line is the 45-degree line, which means that there is the same number in both. And so essentially what we're doing is we're taking everybody above this line to be a refugee in high likelihood. And if you take a look at the line, the observations along the horizontal axis, these are groups where there's almost no refugees, and so think of these, refugees from, say, many Latin American countries. But we're going to be taking the people that are above that dotted line in our group. So who are these? Well, this is a list of the country year pairs in our sample of what they look like, and one question is do these look like refugees that are coming to this country? Well, we can compare it to DHS data based on the age distribution. So in this particular case, the darker bars are refugees that we're identifying in the ACS, and the lighter ones are data that we're getting from DHS. The age distribution looks pretty good. If we take a look at by continent of origin, we're getting fewer from Africa, and a little bit more from Asia, and less from Europe. So we're not matching nearly as great on there, but we are getting people from all of these regions. We match on gender. That works out reasonably well. And in this graph, what we have are, on the vertical axis, the fraction of refugees that end up in a particular state in the ACS, and then on the horizontal axis, what the Department of State says where people went to originally. And again, the 45-degree line is that fraction lines up. And so these are all the different states where people are reassigned or show up in the ACS, and as it turns out, we're sort of getting the geographic distribution of when they come into the country reasonably well. So in that respect, I think this is a fairly representative of the number of refugees that have come into this country over the past, say, 20 years. So the first part of the paper, we take a look at the assimilation of children and how they're doing over time. In this particular case, what we're going to do is construct what we call synthetic cohort of children. And we're going to examine how the outcomes change as they move the age of entry. What's it like for someone that came in at age 4, age 5, age 6? We have a little bit of attention in constructing this data set because you have to give kids time to graduate. So therefore, for high school, we're going to take a look at people that are over 19 years of age. And we also want to follow large groups of people to increase our statistical precision. So that's going to kind of restrict how old you have to be in order to get into the data. Without going into too much detail associated with that, the way that we're going to take a look at this is we're going to take a group of kids 19 to 24. They're going to be U.S.-born natives and refugees, and we're going to focus on refugees that entered ages 4 to 16 in our high school completion analysis. This allows us to follow essentially 5-6-year cohorts that are moving through, and then we're going to do the same thing for college graduation. We're just going to age this group a little bit further. So in that analysis, we're going to take a look at refugees and natives that are 23 to 28. Give them at least a fair shot to have graduated college, and this is going to focus our attention on refugees that entered from ages 8 to 19. Now, in this context, every situation we're going to show two graphs. We're going to, in this presentation, we're just going to take a look at the raw data. What are the means based on age of entry? And we're going to compare that then to the averages for, say, the 19 to 24-year-olds that are native born. Then we're going to do a little bit of adjustments, and we're going to control for the current age of the person, the gender, and we're going to report coefficients on the age of entry, controlling for these, and look and see whether there's some statistical precision associated with this over time. So I'll walk through how to interpret each of these graphs. So this is the raw graph of just the numbers of what is the high school graduation rates for refugees aged 19 to 24 that entered between the ages of 4 and 16. Now, the dotted line that you see around 89% is the average of high school graduation rates for U.S.-born people 19 to 24. So it's a comparable group to who the refugees are. And the thing you notice right away is that high school graduation rates for people that enter from age 13 and under are, in most cases, at or above the high school graduation rate for U.S.-born. There is, however, a very sharp drop-off, there is, however, a very sharp drop-off in high school graduation rates for people that enter at age 14, 15, and 16. And we'll talk about that in just a moment of what there might be causing that. If we take out some observed characteristics like their current age and their gender, and we ask in a statistical sense, is there a difference between the refugees and native born? This is the coefficient we get in the regression. The way that you want to think about this is that the size of that, the dot represents the difference, and so let's take a look at those that are entering at age 5. They are entering, they have about a 5 percentage point higher high school graduation rate than the average U.S.-born student aged 19 to 24. The vertical lines in there are the 95% confidence interval, and so when those overlap with the dotted line, we can't reject the hypothesis that the high school graduation rates are the same between refugees and native born. And so anyone entered between 4 and 13 years of age, statistically, they're graduating at exactly the same rates as an average U.S.-born kid of a similar age. Notice that as we move to 14, 15, and 16, we start to get some big differences. At 16, it's 20 percentage points less. So think of the average being about 89% for U.S.-born, and then that difference is going to be that rate's going to be about 69% for refugees. Now, why is it that the refugees who are arriving at later ages aren't doing so well? Well, I think there's two potential explanations. The first is that the children are arriving with poor language skills. If you're supposed to be graduating around, say, age 17 or 18, you might not have time to recover from a poor language background, and so as a result, it just might be too little time. The second reason is that the ability to be a refugee as an unaccompanied minor increases rapidly at age 15. And so a lot of the kids who are coming at age 15, 16, 17, 18 are coming as unaccompanied minors. And as a result, they're essentially foster children when they're arriving as well. So in the ACS, if we take a look at people in just a cross-section who are arriving within the past 3 years in our survey, and we ask what is their language's ability, the fraction who self-report that they have poor English skills, the number bounces around anywhere from 25 to 35 percentage points. And so on average, kids are doing poor. There's no real trend in this number as we change age of entry. It's just that if I'm a 15-year-old, I have poor English skills, I have very little time to make up for that in my high school career. This is a graph, again, of the people that arrived within the previous 3 years in the 2010 to 2014 ACS. And the ACS has codes that identify who in your household is your biological mother and father. And we are identifying someone who's a potential foster child as someone who is not attached to a birth mother in the data set. And notice that from kids 0 to 14, that number is, maybe around 5%. It bounces around a little bit. But as kids age arrive from ages 15 to 17, that number explodes. And so I think that the unaccompanied minor component of this actually is very important in explaining some of the results. If we take a look at some results on college graduation, we're going to be looking at the same type of analysis. We're going to age the group a little bit. So now we're going to take a look at 23 to, 28-year-olds, and people that entered from ages 8 to 19. So we have to give them a little bit of time to graduate. Not everyone graduates in 4 years, but they can start graduating at age 22. The numbers for college graduation look very similar to the numbers for high school graduation. Here, as we age the people from those arriving at age 8 to those arriving at age 16, there's very little difference in college graduation rates between refugees and U.S.-born students. When we take a look at this in a statistical sense and try to ask the question, are there statistical differences between them? Again, those error bars, the 95% confidence interval, includes the average for the U.S. born over that through age of entry 16. It's only when you get to those teens that are arriving at later ages that we're not getting those differences. One thing I want to say about the education results is that by construction, we're taking a slice in time. We have a cross-section of people, and we're asking what is their level of education at age 23 or age 24. A slice in time estimate like this might understate the progress of refugees because refugees appear to be actively engaged in the education process well into their 30s. In this graph, we have the high school graduation rate by age for refugees entering the U.S. between 14 and 16. So let's take all kids who came to this country at 14 to 16 as a refugee, and let's just ask, what's their high school graduation rate look at age 18, 19, 20, all the way up to 34? Notice that that number is increasing a lot as we move from 18 to 26. They're still actively engaged in trying to acquire skills in the job market. And so let's take a slice in time estimate like we did in the first part of this analysis. So of those, in the left hand of this graph, we have people 19 to 23. The dark line are U.S. born. The three lighter shades are refugees that entered at 14, 15, and 16. But let's age this group a little bit. Notice that, again, there's a big difference in high school graduation rates for these three later age groups, which we saw before. But when we age this group by 5 years, notice that almost all the difference in high school graduation rates go away. So the refugees tend to be much more actively engaged. Someone asked, does high school graduation include GEDs? And in this context, they do. Now, GEDs tend not to earn as much as high school graduates, and there's some work that suggests that GEDs look a lot similar to high school dropouts, but in the same context, there's a lot of GEDs among the U.S.-born population as well. In the college graduation rates, we see the same type of movements. Again, when we focus on people that are 23 to 27, that entered at 17, 18, and 19, compare those to U.S. borns, we replicate the numbers from the previous table, but as we age this over time, we tend to cut those differences down considerably. They never obtain the high school or the college graduation rates as the U.S. born, but a lot of the difference declines. The last thing we take a look at for the refugees that arrive as children is we take a look at a number of different outcomes later on in life. So we age the population a little bit. We have information on their labor force participation, what their earnings are in the job market, whether they're engaged in social programs, what is their income given that they are working, and school attendance. Because we don't have as many refugees as native-borns, we're going to put people into 4 groups: those that are 8 to 10, 11 to 13, 14 to 16, or 17 to 19 years of age when they entered, and we're going to compare those to native U.S. Residents. And again, what we're going to report in this are the coefficient estimates and then the 95% confidence intervals. And so here's how you want to read this. So let's take a look at those that are 17 to 19. Employment rates for this group appear to be at about 2 percentage points lower than the average for U.S. borns. We normalize that to 0, but the 95% confidence interval for 17 to 19-year-olds includes that group, as therefore statistically they're the same. Interestingly, those that arrive ages 8 to 10 seem to be working less. I think this is 23 to 28 than U.S. of similar age. We'll see in just a moment that there's an explanation for this. If we take a look at earnings, in this situation, those 8 to 10 and 17 to 19 seem to be earning less than U.S., but as it turns out, none of these are statistically significant. And if we take a look at the log of earnings, conditional on that you have any earnings whatsoever, that you're engaged in the labor market, there's virtually no difference between U.S. born and the refugees on a statistical sense. Now, let me just go back and ask, why is it that employment rates for those who arrived at ages 8 to 10 seem to be a lot lower? Well, the reason for that is refugees are engaged in in schooling. And so here, the outcome of interest is, are you currently enrolled in school? And what you find, regardless of what age of entry, that there's a lot more school enrollments at these ages for refugees than there are for native-borns. And so overall, the negative results that we saw up above about employment, once we control for those in earnings and employment, they go away once we control for school enrollment. And so in general, I think the story is fairly positive for children that arrive as refugees. I'll have some concluding comments about things we might learn in the refugee population that might carry over to the rest of the U.S. population at the end of the talk. But overall, I think this is a pretty interesting story. So the next thing we do is we essentially try to do the same analysis for refugees that arrived as adults aged 18 to 45. Now, given the way that we have data from Department of Homeland Security and the cross-section of information we have from the American Community Survey, what we can do is take a look at essentially adults that are age 18 to 65 who are U.S. born, compare them to adult refugees that are age 18 to 65 that entered at ages 18 to 45. So we essentially have 20 years over which we can follow people. We're going to take a look at employment and earnings, how people are doing in the job market. We're going to take a look at participation in social insurance programs, TANF and SNAP, and we're going to just follow this cohort over time. And so if I have an 18-year-old in the data set, that 18-year-old could have come here, this year as an 18-year-old. If I have a 40-year-old, that 40-year-old could have come as a 40-year-old or a 39-year-old or a 28-year-old. So there's all kinds of different mixes of ages and age of entry that we're going to try to characterize. Now, in this series of graphs, what we're going to try to take a look at is how people change as they age in place. So the key horizontal axis in the graph is going to be how long you've been in this country. Now, before we start, we have two samples here, refugees that are 18 to 65 but arrived at ages 18 to 45, and we're going to compare those to U.S.-born who are ages 18 to 65. Now, the average age and the fraction female are the same, but it is the case that the observed characteristics which tend to be rewarded in the job market are substantially worse for the refugees. They have a much lower high school graduation rate of 67 compared to 91% for U.S.-born. They have a much lower college graduation rate, 23 versus 37%, and a third of them report they have less than good English skills compared to everyone reporting good English skills among the U.S.-born. So it's going to be no surprise we're going to find out that their characteristics are going to lead to bad labor market outcomes at the start, but again, there's a temporal nature to this that provides some interesting results. So this is a typical graph we have in the paper for the adults who arrived 18 to 45 that we aged 20 years. Again, on the horizontal axis, we have the years since arrival, so we can have people that are arriving this year all the way up through 20 years. The vertical axis is the results from the ACS, and in this particular case, we're looking at people who are participating in the labor force. These are people that are actually at work or looking for work. And again, the dotted line at around 72% is the average for U.S.-borns in the same age range. Well, refugees, when they first enter this country, are only about 50% of them are working, but by the 6th year in the country, refugees are actually working at higher rates than U.S.-born. And that number, peaks at around 81%. So overall, for most of their working life, refugees are working at higher rates than U.S.-born citizens. If we take a look at people that are employed, this is not going to be too different. The only difference is the unemployment rate between them. You get essentially the same story. When we take a look at labor earnings start out very low on an annual basis, and they never obtain the level that the U.S.-born, which is not surprising given the much lower levels of education. But the trend is steeply positive. That's, from the first to the last years in the data set, there's a very strong upward trend that people are earning a lot more as they age in place in the United States. If we ask what fraction are on SNAP, that number's around 80% or 70% the first year in the country, but it goes down to about the U.S. average after about 11 or 12 years. And then if we ask what fraction are on TANF, that shows a very similar time trend where about 12 years afterwards, the number has approached what is a number for an average U.S. citizen. In this particular case, we do the same exercise where we try to control for some observed characteristics. We want to take a look at what is we want to control for gender, we want to control for the age. And so the way that we read this graph is that the dotted line at 0 kind of represents the normalized value of employment for a U.S.-born. If the black line, which is the coefficient estimate, is above that, that means that refugees are working more. If the black line is below the dotted line, that means they're working less. And then the two lines that parallel it in dots above and below in blue are the 95% confidence interval. And so if you take a look at this graph, after 12 years holding education constant, refugees are actually working at higher rates than US born, and this number is anywhere from, say, 5 to 10 percentage points So the temporal nature of this is really important, that what it looks like when they're in the first in this country is very different from what it looks like if they're in the country 10 or 12 years. If we take a look at earnings, again, the U.S. difference, or the difference between refugees and U.S. workers declines over time, but it never vanishes. So the way that you might read this is if you take a look in year one, refugees are earning about $11,000 less than the comparable person who was born in the United States. That number gets cut in half to about $5,000 by about 16, 17 years in the country, okay? If we take a, what might be a reason for the lack of earnings, even once we control for education, it could be that they have poor language skills. This explains maybe half the difference. Once we control for language skill of the person, we see that by years 13 through 20, there's no statistical difference between them, but there is a quantitative difference. It cuts the difference in half by by controlling for language ability. So that explains some of it, but not all of it. If we take a look at the fraction on SNAP, essentially once we control for education and other characteristics, those differences tend to be eliminated by the 12th or 13th year, and the same for, I don't have the graph for TANF in here, but it's kind of the same. All right. So Danny and I spent a considerable amount of time putting this together. We then did a third exercise in the analysis. Given the discussion about refugees, we wanted to take a look at what the fiscal costs of resettling refugees are in this country. Here, we focus on our adult sample, those that arrive 1845 and age in place 20 years. Now, it's a limited sample, but it's a sample we can work with because we have very good information about what their earnings, and we have good estimates of what their taxes are. There's some inherent limitations in what we're doing, and we can talk about them at the end of the talk. But I think this is a kind of a worthwhile exercise given the temporal nature of the results that we found for this group. So what do we want to do? We want to add up what are refugees costing taxpayers when they're resettled to this country. Well, there are two kinds of costs. There's the direct cost of resettlement, we're just going to take the most comprehensive estimate we have of what it costs to run the Refugee Resettlement Program. For simplicity, we're going to assign all of those costs in the year of arrival for the person. And since it's happening 20 years ago, we're going to have to bring that forward by discounting. That ends up to be a small component of the cost of resettlement because the indirect costs tend to be much larger. So refugees are participating in SNAP and in TANF. They're getting Social Security. They're getting supplemental security income. They're enrolled in Medicare and Medicaid. Now, the nice thing is the ACS identifies participation in the social programs. We can impute what costs are for some of these, and in other cases, the ACS asks directly, how much are you getting on TANF? How much are you getting from Social Security? How much are you getting from SSI? So we can add up all those costs. But refugees are working, and as a result, they're paying taxes. So what we're going to try to do is get an estimate of what taxes refugees are paying to all levels of government. What might these taxes be? Well, there's federal income tax. There's going to be state income taxes. There's FICA. There's state sales taxes and property taxes. Now, from the ACS, we have detailed information about family size, marital status, state of residence, how much income they have. And so there is this nice, very detailed program called TaxSim from the National Bureau of Economic Research that inputs, I think, 14 different characteristics and tells you If this were a typical person that was a homeowner in California in 1990, how much is this person going to be paying in federal tax? How much are they going to be paying in state tax? How much are they going to be paying in FICA? So we're going to use TaxSim to estimate the payroll, state, and federal income taxes. Now, the payroll taxes have two components, those paid by the individual and those paid by the firm. Those taxes are generated because the refugee is working, so although explicitly the refugee is not paying the taxes, implicitly they are. So we're going to count the 7.65% Social Security and Medicare tax that's being paid by the firm as attributable to the refugee, and then obviously their 7.65% component as well. Property taxes are reported in the ACS, and then we're going to have to estimate a sales tax paid, and in the paper we outline sort of how we go about doing that. Just a notion, just a discussion about discounting here. We are not following the same people over a 20-year period. We're taking people that arrive today, and we're saying this person represents someone that arrived, say, 20 years ago. And then we're taking a look at someone that arrived last year that represents someone who arrived 20 years ago in their second year, etc. So what we need to do is take those costs in the past and bring them forward. So we do that through appropriate discounting. We assumed a 2% discount rate, given interest rates. That's not an unreasonable guess, but that sort of has to be built into the consideration. So what do these results look like? Well, this is a graph that on the horizontal axis represents the years since arrival in the United States. The vertical axis represents the costs or net cost per year. And the first graph that we have are the social insurance costs. So this is participation in Medicare and Medicaid and SSI and TANF and SNAP. And it's always negative, of course, because these people are participating in the program. This is what we're paying out in social insurance costs. If we were to put in what people are paying in taxes, that's always positive. Notice that it increases steeply over time because people are working a lot more. And then we can put these two together by taking a look at the direct costs. Hold on one second. Taking a look at the net costs. Now, in the net cost, what we have to do is in the first year, add in the direct resettlement costs, which is why that's a big negative number. So we're putting all the resettlement costs in the first year. So what are we interested in doing? We're interested in adding up all these costs over time. So notice that by year 9, it's kind of the break-even point that refugees are taking in benefits, essentially what they're paying out in taxes on a year. From an aggregate standpoint, what we want to do is kind of add up these two different periods. Before that 9th year, notice that we want to add up all that area below that horizontal axis and above the black line. And we want to credit that against everything that's above the black line, or above the horizontal line and below the black line from year 9 on. What's the sum total of what we're calculating? Well, of the roughly 12,000 people we have that we're following over a 20-year period, the relocation costs 20 years ago brought forward were about $14,000. They collected in aggregate over that stream about $86,000 in social insurance costs, but they're paying $122,000 in taxes. On net, as we follow this group over a 20-year period, they're paying about $21,000 more than they are taking in benefits from all levels of government. So overall, this group seems to be paying more than they're taking in. Now, there's a couple limitations to this. One is we're following this group from 18, who arrived at 18 to 45 for 20 years. We're not getting into when they're moving on to Social Security, and we're not getting into when they're moving into Medicare. Those are obviously important costs, but at the same time, we're not adding up anything for the kids that arrived from 0 to 17, which are a group that's doing exceedingly well and has a 40-year work life ahead of them. And so we're ignoring some costs on one side, we're ignoring some benefits on the other. The other thing to remember about the ACS is that the ACS asks people, how much are you getting in Social Security? How much are you getting in from labor earnings? How much are you getting from your pension? Those numbers tend to be poorly recorded. They tend to underestimate income. At the same token, the ACS tends to severely underestimate participation in social insurance programs. So, we're understating how much taxes are being paid because we're not getting the incomes at the right level. We're understating the costs that they're being charged because we're understating how much they're participating in social insurance. These are some limitations of what we're trying to do. Overall, some things to consider. Refugees that arrive before age 14 are not doing as well. Older teens seem to have poor outcomes because of the language barrier. From a policy standpoint, given scarce resources and how well younger teens are doing when they come to this country, it might be worthwhile to experiment with sending more resources to the older teens and try to improve the outcomes. One interesting thing about refugees are essentially in a foster care program through age 21. The typical foster care program at the state is only having kids through age 18. If you take a look at the outcomes of the refugees who arrive in this country as later teens, they're decidedly better than a typical kid in the foster care. Maybe we learn something about the domestic foster care program by the way that we're dealing with refugees. Keeping them on the program a little bit longer seems to generate really good outcomes compared to a typical foster kid. I know the state of California is experimenting with that right now, but it's something I've been thinking about. In general, this whole refugee assimilation area is an area with a lack of data. There are a lot of questions, but very few answers. So some of the questions that we've pondered is, suppose you have a Bhutanese coming into this country, and you're resettling them to an area where there's a lot of other Bhutanese. Should they be located near other people from their own country? Might it be the case that they're going to assimilate less if they're with other Bhutanese? But we don't know. Would adding 3 to 6 months in resettlement time produce better outcomes? Initial conditions matter. And so if they're forced to get a job within 90 days and they end up taking the first job that's not going to help develop their English skills, are we sort of consigning them to lower income over time? Might it be more cost effective to increase a little bit of training on the front end to get better returns at the back end? It seems to me these are areas that are all ripe for experimentation, that we could easily answer these questions with a little bit of resources to try to experiment with this. The one thing I will say is this analysis of the fiscal cost of refugee is admittedly limited given the data that we're using. Survey data tends to understate income and understate enrollment in social programs. There is an alternative source of data out there. A lot of states have administrative data sets that record earnings because they have how much you've paid into unemployment insurance, and states have the data on social insurance program participation, TANF, SNAP, SSI, whatever. If researchers had the universe of people that have been resettled in the states, they could easily be matched to the state administrative data sets, and we would have administrative data on how much they're earning, how much they're taken out of social insurance programs. This actually would be a pretty straightforward data exercise if that linkage of the data for refugees can be matched to these administrative data sets. The nice thing, refugees get Social Security numbers relatively early in the process, and so it ends up to be a pretty straightforward match. So at the end of the day, thanks a bunch for attending. If you're interested in more of what we're doing at LEO, it's leo.nd.edu. And we have a little bit of time left. I can stay on as long as people want to answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Bill. I'm going to open it up now for questions. We've already received a few here, so let me just provide you with those, Bill. One question that came in was regarding whether asylees are counted in the statistics that you provided, and related to that was whether or not there's been any consideration of including Iraqi, Afghan SIVs.
I'm not sure that there's many Iraqis in our data set. If you go back to I think it's going to take me too long to scroll back to where that list was. I can't remember whether there's too many Iraqis. There's a reasonable number of Iranians from the early part of the war. In terms of asylees, we don't know whether people are entering this country as a refugee or an asylee. I think a lot of asylees are coming I don't know how many asylees are coming from these states that we have in our analysis, and so I don't know how to break that apart, to tell you the truth.
Great. Then another question came in from a provider who's working with refugees in San Diego, which has become a resettlement hub for Iraqis and Syrians. He mentions that they're trying to figure out how to best formulate employment and power opportunities and related programming, and they're interested in potentially replicating this type of study that you've done on the local level. Is there a resource or methodology for lay people, might be non-economists or non-academics, to be able to calculate this data at the local level using the ACS? Or you mentioned administrative data from the states. Is there a way that refugee service providers should be partnering with states?
So I would say refugee service partners, if they look, you guys are resettle refugees, and you do that very well. My guess is you don't have the time or resources to do this by yourself. Academics are very interested in this question. I would try to find an academic partner. So University of California, Berkeley has this nice research center where they have this access to a lot of administrative data. Following your refugees in administrative data is something that could easily be done by people that have access to this administrative data. So my recommendation would be you partner with an academic institution, we could potentially help you find some people in your local area that might be interested in this question. It takes you guys have access to the data that is very valuable, which is who your clients are. Academics are looking for interesting research topics, and I think this is one of them, given the attention that this issue has received recently. So I think it might be pretty difficult for most social service agencies to do, given the limited budgets and how thinly staffed you guys are, and how little resources you get to resettle refugees. But I think in this case, you're partnering with some academic institutions might be the easiest way to go.
Great, thanks. And would you say the same for states? Could you talk a little bit more about how states could, if not, could you talk a little bit about how states could go about using the administrative data? So, this is actually such a straightforward problem to analyze. So the University of Texas has this massive administrative data set that has virtually any electronic record that a person generates as a result of coming into contact with state and local governments. Are they in TANF? Are they on SNAP? How much they're paying in unemployment insurance? How much they're taking out in unemployment insurance. These are massive data sets. How much they're taking out in Medicare payments. Every one of these is sort of identified by a Social Security number. If you have Social Security numbers in the universe of people that have been moved into a state, then it becomes a fairly straightforward exercise to sort of say, well, someone that came in 1990, how are they doing today? Someone that came in 2000, how are they doing today? We just look at them in the data set. This might be easier in some states than others. I think the state of Kentucky
has a single source of entry, so they would have the universe of all the refugees. The problem has been getting the list of all the refugees and take it to the administrative data. We haven't been able to find, the group that would sort of provide that with us, that information for us. But there's a number of different states that have these very nice administrative data sets that can be used for research purposes. So I think that's, where a lot of future of refugee research might come.
Related to that, someone has raised a question around privacy concerns related to tracking folks via Social Security numbers. Any thoughts on how to navigate that?
Yeah, so the privacy concerns are pretty well managed. And so there's three agencies here. There's an agency that has the refugee information. There's the state that has the data. And then there's the researcher. The researcher never sees the Social Security numbers. They never know the identity of the refugees. So an agency would provide a list of who the refugees are. The refugees' information is linked to administrative data. They generate a random number, and then that information is passed on to the researchers. It's done in many different instances. I don't know, there's a lot of papers that have been done recently that are using tax record data from the federal government. People that have been involved in experiments a long time ago trying to reduce class sizes in the state of Kentucky. You go to people have gone to the IRS has merged in tax records. You get sanitized data that has no identifying information about the person, but you have who is in the treatment program and who's in the control, and you can take a look at their outcomes 20, 30 years after the experiment was run. So this is actually a fairly well-oiled machine on the research side. There's pretty good protocols to protect the anonymity of the participants, and it's just a bunch of bilateral exchanges that occur from the provider to the state, from the state to the researcher. So this has been used quite frequently in medical research and social science research. And there's no reason why it can't be done in this situation.
Great, thanks, Bill. One final question. Given how variable different populations are for service providers, the participant is asking, says that they imagine there must be a lot of variation across outcomes for different countries of origin. Would it be useful to draw conclusions that are more specific to certain populations? Do you disaggregate at all by the country of origin?
No. So I think the best we can do is really the continent of origin. We end up with about 20,000 people age 18 to 45. There's some pretty small countries in there. We're sort of hurting for statistical power. What the best I think we could hope for is to break it up by continent. We really haven't looked at that just quite yet because we are looking for the more aggregate numbers at this point. But that is something we're sort of looking at for the second round of this research.
Great. And just as we close, are there any other implications for these findings, particularly related to recommendations you may have for programs or services? There are a couple people asking about programs what the implications of these findings for programs that would benefit older teens, or any other implications of findings for states, resettlement agencies, researchers, or policymakers?
Well, I do think the results for the teens suggest that this is, the ones that arrive at later teens are a vulnerable group. And so given limited resources and you want to have the biggest bang for buck, there might be some gains from experimentation in that group. The other thing that's clear is that language is so important in this context, and so, but that doesn't mean that, language training is actually going to make a big difference. It'd be nice to experiment with that. But for me, I think that this very vulnerable group, the ones that are arriving, say, 14 to 18, seems to be an interesting group that you might want to take a look at as getting some more experimentation in terms of trying to improve their outcomes.
Great, thank you. There's one more final question. I know we're at 3 p.m., so if you have to leave, please go ahead and do so. But there is one question I think it's worth posing to you, Bill. Are there any differences in outcomes by state of resettlement?
No. Well, we haven't looked at that. Let's just say we knew we were kicking a hornet's nest when we got these numbers. And so we decided to not kick a beehive and a yellow jacket's nest at the same time. So we haven't looked at that issue just yet. So.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Bill. This has been a wonderful presentation. Thanks to everyone who joined today. You can contact us at meta@rescue.org if you have any questions. You can also reach out to us, and we can forward any questions to Bill. Bill also provided his contact info. We also have many resources available on our website. You can go to metasupport.org for other resources, and you can follow us on Twitter at US Metasupport. Thanks, everyone. We will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.